Hey, well, welcome to the Grace Podcast. I'm super excited for this episode. We've got Mark and Christine Van Straaten. If you watched our Sunday service, you would have seen an interview with them. They're the founding pastors of Grace Family Church, planted Grace 30 years ago. We're leading a church before that for 10 years, so been in ministry for 40 years. And what does that make you, 50, eh? No.
Yeah, really.
And just a wealth of wisdom and experience, been through good times, been through bad times, ups and downs, and you may or may not be familiar with the story. But I'm just so glad that we got to chat, because today what I really want to ask you is, what does it mean to leave a legacy? What does it mean to finish well? Unfortunately, it doesn't take long to think of a good couple of names that haven't finished well. Even in the Bible, we see characters like Saul, starting out so well and yet finishing badly. You guys, you still love the church, you still love one another, you still love Jesus. How did you get there? What advice would you give to someone starting out or younger to finish well?
Yeah, that's a good question, Thomas. And I don't think I haven't written the book yet on 5 steps to finish well. I must say this. I don't know about Christine, but in my mind, we never set out to leave a legacy. I think we set out to do what we felt God called us to do. I think one of the advantages that I've had is that I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, which if that means anything, it basically means that I'm kind of in my head a lot of the time, and I think things through quite seriously. But the reason why I use that is because I think for us, the main objective for us was a sense of call and a sense of mission and a sense of character. One of the gifts that I was given, which I think sadly too few people are given this gift, is that I grew up in a very stable, well-adjusted home. I was listening to a talk the other day about being coached and coaching. And this person kept referring to people's parents, and the kind of sometimes the hangover of not necessarily being parented well. Christine less so than me, maybe. She can talk for her own self, but I think I was parented so well that for me, when I think of these other, you refer to people who haven't finished well and who've done way more stuff than Christine I've ever done. I have no idea what some of their fuel is. But for me, my fuel has always tried to be about a relationship with God, a sense of calling, and that really, there's a lot that we could talk about. But
I love that. I think, for me, I think, one of the biggest challenges for a younger generation, and they talk particularly around the millennial generation, is this idea of identity,
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying there is, in some ways, just by virtue of the home in which you were brought up, you had a head start. Maybe not financially or whatever, what school you went to, but certainly in knowing who you are. And I think so much of when things haven't ended well, whether that's in business or church or whatever that looks, it has come out of that place of deficit because you're searching for something to fill a hole that was never there. And so in some ways you say, you didn't have a perfect upbringing, but that gave you an advantage in a sense of knowing who you were and why you were,
No, without doubt.
Yeah.
I think that, listen, I never had a perfect home.
Yeah.
But I knew that home was a very, very safe place for me.
Yeah.
And I do think, and even still, having said that, there's no doubt that when I started the church in Ipageni, I was 24, and I always say it tells a great story, but it's not the right way to do it, because there was a hangover of that, and I had an ambition. I wanted to have the biggest church in South Africa by the age 30. So I'm not totally pure. I'm very competitive, and I'm very ambitious. But I do think that my father was a great centering person. He always would tell me, "Be careful, my boy. Be careful, my boy. Be careful, my boy." And I got irritated with that, especially when when you, in your own mind, you've got some traction. I mean, our church in Mpangeni, we started with 18 people. The next weekend we had 180.
Sure.
We're not talking about a city here. We're talking about a little town. And I thought the man of God had arrived in Mpangeni, you know. And the next Sunday there were 50 again. But the point I'm making is that I think that you really need to come to terms with who you are and what you are. And for me, I one of the other and then I'll let you talk, my love. But I think one of the things I became very clear about was my talent. I really define myself as average. You know, my parents wanted me to be above average at school. So if the average in the class for maths was 62, all I had to do was 63, not 80. You know? And I think for me, the idea of being faithful to my talent, I don't try and pretend to be. I mean, I wanted to be.
I remember you preaching that once in the early days around the story of the talents.
Yeah.
And you know that some people are given 1, some 2, some 3. It's not really about how much you're given. It's about what you do with what you're given.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people end up wasting their time comparing. Well, how come I got 1 and he got 3? But the story is not about who got what. It's about what they did with their talent. I think you right from the beginning said, I'm going to hire people who are smarter than me, who have higher talent than me, because I know where my capacity is. You know.
Mm.
Christine, I know as Mark speaks about knowing who you are, why you are, there was a season in the life of the church where you kind of felt like you didn't know who you were, or you lost that sense of identity. Talk us through some of that.
Yeah, I think my childhood was a little different. My mother was a wonderful person in my life. I was one of 4 children, and my older sister and my younger brother were naturally compatible with my dad, whereas myself and the next brother weren't. And it's quite interesting, we're the 2 that went into ministry.
Sure.
And we were like poetical, philosophical soul people, and the other 2 were career-orientated, like business people. So looking back as an adult, I can see the miss, you know, where my brother and I missed it with my dad. But the effect was not good. So my inner sense of I was worthy of love was definitely in deficit because of the miss that I had with my dad emotionally, and how I didn't get from him what I wanted. He didn't know how to give it. So I think that for me caused problems along the way in terms of, you want to talk about a heritage or a legacy. I think a lot of my story that really blesses people is how I broke. And I had this 4 years into our church plant here at Grace Family Church in Durban. I experienced a clinical depression, and it took me a long time to work my way out of that. And I think if I leave something behind that is to be admired, it would be how Mark has described. He saw me fight for my mental health.
Sure.
And how I did anything and everything to get better. And so I always saw myself as a bird that flew but with a broken wing. And I don't know whether that's correct or not. I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, so I'm a very compliant, peace-loving person who just wants to make everybody around me feel grand.
But the danger of the 9 is that they can put everyone else's needs ahead of their own and then become resentful.
Yeah, well, I became depressed.
Which is internal resentfulness.
Oh, it's definitely suppressed anger, without a doubt. But yeah, so like Mark said, I've never lived my life thinking I want to leave a legacy. I think, as you've just asked the question, I haven't had much time to give it thought, but you have to strive to truly be yourself and to be realistic about who you are and comfortable with who you are. So I've never been a visionary and a future-looking person and a driven person like my husband. But I've been happy to tuck in a sense behind it, because that really is the way I'm wired.
Yeah.
That's where I'm happiest. I have a beautiful gift that God has given me of music and worship, and I've just flowed in that. And for me, it's been a natural, uncomplicated thing. So I haven't allowed myself, and I never was pushed by our church environment to be a
Something you're
certain
not,
way
yeah.
as a pastor's wife, you know. You make the announcements and you also
Lead the
preach.
women's ministry.
You lead the women's ministry and you definitely dress really
You're a
nicely.
Proverbs 31 woman.
Yeah. And so I successfully, I think, avoided being pushed into something that it wasn't who I was. And I think that whoever you are, and whatever your life is, if it's a legacy that you're going to leave behind for your children or for whatever environment in which you function and are influential, that is the gift, I think, to be comfortable in your own sin, to be sincere. And I suppose in a way I'm not saying this is what I am, but I've seen this in Mark, a kind of a humility where you don't think of yourself more than what you actually are.
Yeah, there's a scripture around that.
Yeah, like there's a realism and that you're grateful to God for who you are. So, I wanted to say this at some point, and maybe this is the little open door for me, because I'm not a person who takes the floor and holds the conversation, especially in our family. I tend to be making the coffee while the vicious and vigorous conversations are happening.
First time I had dinner with your family, I thought there was a fight. I'm just like, no, that's just a normal conversation.
Heated and opinionated
Yeah, totally.
and looking for a chance to say something. Anyway, so the point I'm making is that I wanted to say that I think for Mark, as I've witnessed his life now, for 42 years we've been married. Is it only 42?
43.
Oh, 43.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, I think the thing I've seen in Mark is he's had such integrity in terms of where he positions himself and where he's positioned his calling and his responsibility toward the church, to the point where now, at this end of life, he sometimes looks back and regrets how he put the church first. But I remember Jim Collins talking about a number 10 leader who puts the organization ahead of their own stuff. And I really feel like Mark did that over the years, that he was always honest, he was always transparent, and very respectful of others that he worked with. And so I think that thread and that will run through Grace Family Church. And it's not because we said, what can we do to leave a legacy? We were true to God and true to ourselves and true to our calling. And it's quite simple, really.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like the legacy is the byproduct. You know,
Yeah.
you guys have said we didn't start out with that. We were started out to be obedient and faithful, but as a result. And I think just a couple of things I'd love to draw out of that. The first is thanks for the Enneagram plug. If you haven't done the Enneagram, really encourage. It's just a great tool. I think what's great about it is that it's not just about your strength, it's also about what those strengths look like unredeemed. And I know it's been super helpful for Jess and I in our marriage. Leading teams, it's been incredible because it does show you both the light and the dark side of where that can go, you know. But I think a big thing is run in your lane, you know. Just run in your lane because, you know, you weren't wired to be the visionary, and Mark certainly wasn't wired to be the worship leader. Thank
for
God.
sure.
You know, but learning, and I think sometimes that takes time. I know for Jess and I remember someone saying, you know, it takes. She's not going to be the person you said. She's not going to be the person you're married to later, because we change, we mold, and sometimes it takes time to find out what your lane looks like and who you are. But if you're faithful in that, it's almost like God will multiply. And the other thing I think, Christine, that you said was just so powerful is, in many ways, it's been your weakness and your pain that's actually left the biggest legacy.
Yeah.
I was listening to a Rick Warren talk the other day, and he was talking about the same thing, finishing well. And he had the comment about, you know, social media, and he says, you know, social media, the guys are using it all wrong. And he says, you know, it's a great tool, but he says, you can't help people with your success. You can help people through your weakness, through your pain.
That's right.
And that really stuck out to me because I think so much of what we see on social media is people's success. Look at me, look how well I'm doing. And that can bring some level of inspiration, but I think most of the time we connect with people through their weakness.
All right.
And I think if we can help people by sharing, hey, I'm also struggling. Hey, I'm also going through this. Hey, this is not all roses and you know, and it's tough. I think that's where we actually build a real influence, and that's where we leave a legacy. And I think your vulnerability and sharing some of your own dark moments has probably been far more helpful than you sharing the highlights reel, you know.
You know, one of the things I learned in the year that I was in the therapy, because I wasn't coming out of this thing on my own, and I'll never forget the day she said to me, you know, Christine, the closer who you really are is with the role that you play in life. The closer those things are to each other, the better your mental health. And I think before the burnout, I was trying to fill a role that wasn't really who I am.
Yeah. It's that gap between the private and the public. You know?
Yes, and who you think you should be, and who the world is saying you should be, and yeah, it takes time to figure that out, what lane to run in and at what pace to run. It's another one. So yeah, I think self-awareness, and for our generation, we're in our 60s now. Back in the day, I mean, you didn't go for counseling as pastors. You know, you were victorious, and you were the ones who knew what was going on. Yeah, you were the one giving counseling. And so I think the introspectiveness and the self-awareness and learning to reflect on what's going on in your inner world, it came to us later. That's why I burnt out, because I didn't know how to do that. So I think that's crucial. But I mean, your generation, I think, have a lot more tools.
I think, just from another changing gears a little bit, one thing that was clear for me about this legacy thing, and we can move on then, is that I always felt that I wanted to leave an inheritance, was the word. There's a scripture in the Proverbs that says, leave an inheritance to your children's children. So that was always a factor in my head. And also in terms of the church, you know, I'd seen others who have done what we've done. But they get to a stage where they don't have the energy, they don't have the drive, they don't have that spark anymore. But they hold on for a sense of identity and security.
Because they don't know who they are if they're not doing that thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even still, that is something I'm dealing with, you know, because I'm not doing that thing anymore.
Yeah.
But I was very clear in my own head that, you know, you hear sportsmen saying, you know, I'm leaving on my own terms.
Yeah.
And there's something wise about that, because it's horrible to go out and the last thing people remember of you is that you hung on too long.
Yeah,
you know
I
what
remember that horrible line from Andy Stanley, you're not remembered by your final hour, by your finest hour, but by your final hour.
Exactly.
And it's true, but it's so harsh.
Yeah. Well, it's harsh, you know, like a lot of truth. It's really easy to speak about. It's hard to live. But for me, the gift that I realized we could have is that grace flourishes in our absence. You know, and that's why. So that's just from the legacy point of view. The legacy that in my mind
there was
an
inheritance. There was always an inheritance.
You know, I mean, I know churches that got too big, and the guy stayed on too long, and they got too small.
Yeah.
And it's still small. And then you've got buildings this size somewhere, a lot around the world, with a couple of hundred people who are still hanging in with the 70-year-old guy who started it.
Yeah. That's really great. That's super helpful. And I think this is not, obviously your guys' context and my context is church world, but I think these principles apply, you know, and I think when you look at, you know, whether it's a moral failure or an ego failure or whatever that is, I think that line you said, you know, when your public persona and your private persona, when the gap between those two things gets too big, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I think it's this wholeness and this integration. So final words as we kind of wrap the podcast up. We're talking about, you know, 30 years of faithfulness, 30 years of God's intervention, just sort of words of wisdom around finishing well, leaving a legacy, keeping your heart pure, maybe even just a relationship. You're still married, you still talk to each other, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think, Tom, you know what? You can maybe recap your 5 points that you finished the other Sunday from Richard Rohr. You know, life is hard, it's not fair, and all those things. You know what I mean? There's no doubt. I mean, Christine and I, we've had a hard marriage. You know, I've been right, she's been wrong. And it's taken me nearly 43 years, and I still haven't persuaded her.
To realize that that's not
So
true.
what are you saying to me is hang on, because at one stage is that what you're saying?
No.
Keep going? No.
That's what keeps us going. That's what keeps us going. Then one day, no, I just think that I remember a friend saying to me that self-pity is the devil's babysitter. You know, and I think we live in a world today where we seek to be a victim. There's always a reason why I never got the prize or I never got to the place. And I'm talking like a real old 64-year-old dude now.
No, that victim mentality is strong across the generation.
And I just think to yourself, you know what? We always have a choice. You know, it's the stuff that you're preaching on.
Yeah.
It's the view that you're taking. You get to choose the view. And I can tell you now that I've had the wrong view about a lot of things, a lot of my life. Okay. But I think if the one thing that I will always come back to, and that is I have responsibility for the things I can control.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much that I can't control. And COVID talks about that stuff, about your
Yeah.
circle of influence and your circle of
The
concern.
Stoics, focus on what you can control.
Focus on what you can control, and build your life onto that. And
Yeah.
and you will go the distance. But if you're always looking for the quick way out, or
The magic
you're
formula.
going to have 6 or 7 in a career. You're going to have maybe 5 or 6 exponential moments. Where everything changes. But most of life,
It's just step by step,
it's the next
plod
step,
by plod.
and we hate that.
the 20-mile march.
We
yeah.
don't want that. We want the quick. We want it every day, the miraculous. Well, good luck, brother.
Yeah.
You're going to be disappointed. So that's my final words. Take ownership of your own life.
Yeah,
I
that's
can't control Christine, even in her depression. We worked through that stuff. I felt responsible and all that kind of stuff. Her counselor said to her, you can't blame the church and you can't blame your husband. Now, what are we going to do to fix it?
Yeah, it's good. I love it, guys. I love it. I think we started a conversation around what does it mean to leave a legacy? What does it mean to finish well? And I think the bottom line is it's actually just about focusing on the next step and just being obedient and faithful in that thing. And in some ways, leave the legacy and the thing up to God, because He's going to do that if we're faithful in the small things. And so thank you guys for just sharing your time with us. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Stay tuned, subscribe, like for more interviews like this that hopefully can help you in your day-to-day life, in your faith. If you missed the message on Sunday, catch up, and we'll see you next time.